Our next speaker is Annika Vawter, and she's doing a project that's incredibly interesting to me related to Florida and sea level rise and coastal inundation. And I just got to say, I've been to law school and gotten a PhD in atmospheric science, and I've seen a lot of people who had really excellent quantitative skills and excellent analytical skills, but I don't know if I've seen both of those in one place until I met Annika. So just really impressed by the interdisciplinary ability that Annika has, and I think that I think just perfect for this program, and I was really happy to have you in the program this year. With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Corey, and thank you everyone for who's in here in person and who's here virtually. We really appreciate it. Sorry, I lost the mouse. Here it is. Okay, so my name is Annika Vawter, and my project is on contamination and inundation in the state of Florida. Specifically, I want to look at mapping inundation threats to hazardous waste sites and their impacts on coastal neighborhoods. Okay, so brief outline. I'll be talking about my project motivation, and then I'll sort of go through the climate impacts that are occurring in Florida now, including hurricanes and storm surge, sea level rise, and then hazardous waste and what that is exactly. And then I'll discuss the interactive map component. So my motivation, I was really interested in the impacts on Superfund sites, which are highly contaminated lands in America, with flooding and rainfall, as well as sea level rise. And there were some studies that looked at the extent to which these sites and the contamination was impacted, but I didn't see very much expansion into other hazardous waste sites. So I was curious about the broader scope of contaminated lands and the impacts on local communities, especially when they're inundated through different methods. So my goal was to combine the elements of inundation from sea level rise, abbreviated here as SLR, and flooding from tropical storm surges with hazardous waste site locations in Florida, which I identified using Florida's Department of Environmental Protection. And in this way, create a synthetic interactive mapping tool which can help visualize impacted neighborhoods on a more local scale, as well as a broader comparative scale at the state scale. This will help inform cleanup priorities, planned retreat, coastal resilience, and potentially grant funding for local communities or regional groups to recognize areas that need some work in either cleanup sites or managed retreat in regulatory areas, and focus specifically on these more impacted areas. So why did I pick Florida? Basically, it has a very flat topography. It's really highly susceptible to sea level rise, as well as tropical storm impacts. It has a high level of hazardous waste sites, including Superfund sites. There are 17 throughout the state, which is the third highest state throughout the nation. There are also really high coastal populations, particularly in Miami and Tampa. So a little background on inundation and then on hazardous waste sites. So again, with Florida, this image that you see here is the hurricane strikes that occur on coastal areas in Florida. And as you can see, it's highly projected out into the middle of the ocean and the Gulf. It's hit on both sides from tropical storms at various times in the season. And this impact of hurricanes and then resultant storm surge inundation really impacts these coastal communities. And you can just see the coastline of Florida itself is just so huge. There's so much to be impacted there. We know because of climate science that extreme weather is becoming more intense and destructive. This includes hurricanes and tropical storms, and we expect this trend to continue in the coming years, and it is necessary to plan for it now. Sea level rise is also occurring, and as you can see, Florida is highly impacted. The coastlines change, and this impacts the extent of flooding and of inundation. There's also quite a lot of hazardous waste sites in Florida. These are existing health and environmental threats on the land, and these sites can become temporarily or chronically inundated. Okay, so a little more on hurricanes and storm surges. If you don't know what a hurricane is, you haven't been paying attention. So I will focus mostly on storm surges. They are caused when high winds from hurricanes essentially push water toward the coastline, and it creates this rise in the sea level, which results in flooding on land. This rise can be up to 30 feet high, and it can inundate not only coastal areas, but inland areas as well. It's an extreme threat. It causes erosion, flooding, recurrence, destruction, and loss of life. It's also highly impactful on public health. And then Florida is the state that's most vulnerable to storm surge. There are 2.9 million homes that are vulnerable to it, and between 2.5 and 7.5 million people, depending on the different hurricane category. This is just an example of some storm surge damage. This used to be an entire community, and now there's one home left. This is in Texas, not in Florida. And this is just a visual example of the extent of wind forcing water at different levels. So you can see as wind is stronger, it pushes this surge higher and higher, and damage can become catastrophic. So sea level rise, this is another component of inundation. We know that sea levels are rising around the globe, but the rate varies regionally, which I think is very interesting. Around Florida, it's approximately 4 millimeters per year, but it does vary based on the basin that you're looking at and even the region of the coastline. Compound inundation is the term for the elevated initial sea surface, which sets up a heightened storm surge. This is where these two combine. We have sea level rise that's increasing and a storm surge that is able to reach further inland than it would initially in the past. For my project in particular, I used scenarios from the University of Florida Geoplan Center. They modeled localized extent of sea level rise by combining the various inputs of the data, which included a digital elevation model, NOAA sea level rise projections, and the regional influence of bathymetry on different counties in Florida. This is just a projection of from NOAA's sea level rise projections. Essentially, sea level rise is tied to the atmospheric carbon amount. And if we are committed to certain pathways of decarbonization, there is a chance of lowering the eventual sea level rise. So that's these lower scenarios. However, if we continue on as we have and we do not attempt to decarbonize, that represents the higher levels of sea level rise. Essentially, the more we decarbonize, the more that we can help to control sea level rise. So a little bit on hazardous waste sites. Basically, hazardous waste sites contain hazardous waste. These include pollutants, contaminants, toxins, things like arsenic, metals, polybisphenol, things that are very harmful to individuals' health in the neighboring areas. Cleanup sites are the sites that are run by federal and state agencies. They regulate when hazardous waste is spilled. They help to take it out of the land. So essentially, a cleanup site is one that has a present threat of contamination and is directly impacting communities. A regulatory site, in comparison, is a facility that's registered to handle hazardous waste, but there's no spill there. So this represents a potential threat. So I argue that both cleanup sites and regulatory sites present equal, perhaps not equal, but effective areas for potential contamination. Essentially, if you consider inundation in a spill site, this is going to extend to the local community. Water comes in, extrudes chemicals from the land that exists there, and brings it beyond the boundary into local populations. The same can happen in storm surges. Storm surges are typically more destructive, come from above. Sea level rise comes from below. But each of these has the ability to impact these different sites. And we can see the impact of inundated hazardous waste sites. This is a picture of an EPA site, completely flooded. If you imagine this was once full of chemicals, those chemicals are not within the boundary lines anymore. So it draws these chemicals into the neighboring areas. And I wanted to look at which neighborhoods, which census tracts were particularly affected by this threat of inundation, both from sea level rise and from storm surge. So I used ArcGIS to map the inundation hazards. And I'll talk a little bit more about the data as I go along. Essentially, my end product, which is still being completed, is an interactive map which allows individuals, neighborhoods, regional planners, anyone who's interested in looking at a local or a regional or even a state scene, essentially. It helps them identify site-specific threats as well as relative census tract threats. In this way, they can comparatively assess the threat of one neighborhood to another, especially before potential destruction. If there's a hurricane path that's projected, they can look and see which sites may need more, which census tracts may need more specific attention or better remediation efforts afterward. Or in before the inundation event, if you are considering remedial planning or manage retreat, you are able to more directly identify the specific sites and the specific areas that need the most attention now, based on different sea level rise and storm surge projection scenarios. So essentially, it's an assessment tool to help site cleanup priority, adaptation and mitigation priority of regulatory sites, as well as the relative neighborhood impacts after the inundation or the storm event. So this is an example of a Category 3 storm surge inundation. This is modeled using NOAA's SLOSH model, and this is the maximum extent of inundation. So you can see the entire Everglades on the south tip of Florida is highly impacted. This is the relative extent of the flooding. You can see areas of Tampa are highly inundated as well, areas of Jacksonville and the river that flows south through it, as well as the upper panhandle of Florida, and Louisiana is off to the side there. And so this is basically a visual sample of how far a Category 3 storm could reach, a very, very bad one, in any particular area of this state. And then if we overlay the sites on top of it, what we see is each of these dots is a cleanup or a regulatory site that is active. I did not include closed sites because those were considered cleaned up. Essentially, they are considered safe. And then, but basically, we can see that there's a high concentration of impacted sites, both cleanup and regulatory, in the Tampa area, especially in the Bay there, along the Gulf coastline to the south, in Miami to a lesser extent, and then in Jacksonville. So this helps visualize the total extent of potential hazards. And again, this is a Category 3 storm surge. Category 5 is a much greater threat, whereas Category 1 impacts far fewer sites. And then this is a sea level rise scenario. This depicts the inundation between 2040 and 2100 that's predicted with the University of Florida's sea level rise modeling, which is based on NOAA's modeling, but they did a regional assessment. And so essentially, there are varied levels of sea level rise because sea level rise varies along the coast. So you can see in 2040, we see it rising between 1 and 1.2 feet. And then in 2070, we see 2.1 to 2.4. And by 2100, we see 3.6 and 4. And it's important to note that this is an intermediate sea level rise scenario. The University of Florida actually modeled each of those different lines that I showed you with the different remediation of efforts for atmospheric carbon or lack thereof, which were the steeper ones. So the map includes different projections based on how humans decide to act to combat climate change, which is important for site planners to consider. So this is an overlay with the impacted sites from sea level rise in this particular scenario. This one includes the types of sites. We see brownfield sites, which are essentially old industrial sites, bad contamination. And then we see Superfund sites. These are abandoned and also very bad, regulated federally. We see more local programs, the dry cleaning solvent cleanup program and petroleum contamination program. These are oil and dry cleaning solvent spills. And then we see site investigation where there's evidence of a spill. We see regulatory sites, which includes hazardous waste facilities, treaters, storers, disposers, regulators, transporters. And we see the storage tank monitoring, which is essentially a network of every storage tank that's regulatable within the state of Florida. So all of this amounts, with all of the active sites, to approximately 86,000. And so we can see there's not that many that are impacted in this particular scenario, but you can start to target areas where you may want to either remove a storage tank, for example, or you may want to look at a site and say, is this safe from a certain level of sea level rise, the expected level? Or will a Category 3 hurricane knock this over, or will it extrude these chemicals from this known spill site? Can we clean it up more quickly? These are the questions that this map is intended to answer. Okay, and then this is extracting to 2100. We can see there are quite a lot more impacted sites. So you see the variability over time. And again, this is the intermediate sea level rise scenario. When you start looking at the extreme levels, or even one below that, you see quite literally tens of thousands of sites that are impacted. And then this is an example of the census tract level view of what we're, let's see, this is the 2050 intermediate sea level rise. So by 2050, this number of sites in each of these census tracts will be impacted. So this is able to specifically target areas that are more or less impacted and get a relative measure of these these effects. So between the sea level rise scenarios and the storm surge scenarios, you get a more comprehensive picture of contamination sites, active contamination sites, and potential contamination sites, those regulated facilities throughout the state. And I hope that this tool will be able to be used effectively on a local and a state basis. And the methodology can be used, actually extrapolated to different states and territories in order to replicate this analysis. So we get a broader picture of not just contamination in local areas in Florida, but around the entire coast of the United States, because we know that sea level is rising. It will happen, and it's important that we plan for it. And the impacts of storms, extreme weather, and sea level rise on these local neighborhoods are very severe. So the extent of this is the interactive web application. The intent is to communicate the results using comparative scenarios, as I've said, target remediation and cleanup efforts via climate-related priority. This may include some policy changes, either at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's level or the EPA level. And then future applications, again, replicable methodology for other states and expansion into other contamination risks. This could include solid waste sites and wastewater. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a big project, and I really appreciate the help of my Capstone committee, Corey and Mark, as well as Heidi, who taught me ArcGIS. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annika. Miles already has the microphone.
Yeah. No, Annika, that was fantastic. And I think the applicability of the program in itself is really powerful. So I encourage you to advocate for that and reaching out to these universities and government agencies. I really liked how you mentioned how marginalized communities, primarily Black and Brown communities, are near these locally unwanted land properties or superfunds. And so in your research, really under the umbrella of environmental racism, did you come across any current campaigns or movements centered around environmental justice pertaining to housing?
You know, I did, not specifically pertaining to housing. It was more on a community basis, but I did find it was sort of a regional compact, if you will, that identified the risks of these contamination sites and advocated for people to be educated and to take action on them. And that was just one example. But Florida is actually, it's been in the news lately. There was a spill at Piney Point Reservoir, which is actually it's not a hazardous waste facility per se, but it stores phosphogypsum, which is a byproduct of phosphate mining. And so it's essentially mining sludge, which you may have heard of. This infrastructure sprung a leak, and they advocated for moving the wastewater into the bay, which created quite a lot of algal problems, essentially. You can still look it up. It's still an ongoing issue. It's very interesting. But it was that or risk a 20-foot wall of water, according to the news reports, surrounding the local homes. And so it's these choices where you have crumbling infrastructure, you have lack of planning, you have lack of policy, you have lack of regulation in this case. And they form this perfect storm where you don't know it's a problem until it's too late, unless you're using a tool like this and you're really taking a look at these particular areas that need work. Great question, thank you.
Great talk. Congratulations on the project. I heard some talks not long ago about the risks of sea level rise in South Florida. And one of the things they mentioned was that their freshwater supply comes from a single aquifer in Dade County. I wonder about the proximity of these Superfund sites to that. They were very concerned that if there was ever saltwater inundation of that aquifer, it would put all of Dade County in jeopardy.
Yeah, absolutely. I know South Florida, it has a really porous ground structure, so they are really worried about saltwater intrusion into these areas. And then separately, the Superfund site, I believe there is one just on the coast, just north of Miami. And then there's obviously quite a lot of other contamination sites there, as well as septic tanks, which don't work if they're underwater. So there's been a big push for Miami to have like septic tank replacement. But I do know, I did a little bit of reading about that aquifer, and I'm not sure of the specific impacts there, but it's definitely a concern. And quite a lot of the state is also run by drinking water from wells, that is, all around the state. So it's definitely a huge concern.